It's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Ed Lazowska for giving the distinguished lecture. The third in the series this year? Are we up to 3? This is the third?
Yeah.
In this year's series of lectures. I've known Ed for a long time.
Thank you for not saying how long.
I served as his grader at one point. We were in undergrads together at Brown University. And it's the kind of situation where you could say to everybody in the class, look to your left, look to your right. One of you is going to be a great star. So this was it. That turned out to sort of do everything and really make it big. Ed is the Bill and Melinda Gates Chair at the University of Washington, and he's been at Washington, I guess, your whole career, since you finished the degree. I forgot to say, Ed also followed me to Toronto afterwards, where he got his PhD, and we just marched along like that.
Where I have to admit, I was my wife's grader. So.
Ed's also the director of the eScience Institute at Washington, and externally he serves as the chair of the Computing Community Consortium, which I'm sure he's going to tell us more about somewhere. That's the logo down there in the lower right. Ed has gotten all sorts of awards, including Distinguished Teacher Award, Distinguished Graduate Mentorship Award, Distinguished Service Award, the Service Award being given by the CRA, which is a more than national, multinational organization, so this is a very prestigious award. He's also been named a Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Fellow of the ACM, a Fellow of the IEEE, and
we're about out of time.
The National Academy of Engineering, which I knew that there was one more in that list. As somebody once said, here is a person who has already gotten all of the awards and written all of the right papers and has done all of the right things. So it's worthwhile listening to what he has to say. Today he's going to tell us about computing past, present, and future.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. It's been an exhausting day. I've had a great time, and there's just tons of interesting stuff going on. I've really had a thoroughly good time and look forward to tomorrow. This talk is going to be a little bit long on rah-rah and a little bit short on technical content. I hope that's okay, but I just want to make you aware of that at the outset. What I'm going to do is spend a few minutes just sort of reminding, particularly you younger people, of what we've done as a field. Then I'm going to talk about what this Computing Community Consortium is about. It's a terrible name, but I think it's a pretty worthwhile organization. I'm going to talk about some research challenges going forward, many of which are being pursued by people here in the Cheriton School. So it's really impressive, the sort of congruence. And then I have sort of 3 little rah-rah exhortations for you. So let me go back through this history stuff for a second. I want to go back 40 years, actually to 1969. You guys are probably too young to remember the Wayback Machine, but I grew up on this. So 2 years ago, 1969, I claim there were 4 great things that happened. Okay, 4 really hugely high impact things. Who can remember one of them? 1969. Moon landing. Great, okay? So, this gigantic engineering accomplishment, okay? Just phenomenal. So, yeah, that's when Armstrong walked on the moon. We'll come back to the space program again in a minute. What else happened in 1969? Woodstock. We got Woodstock here somewhere. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. That's, what would you do without the web? Is this the greatest? Okay. Looks like Waterloo today. Okay, what else happened in '69? Frank, you should remember this.
Relational databases.
The Mets won the World Series. He's from New Jersey, and he's forgotten the Mets. All right? And the 4th was ARPANET, okay? Somebody said that right at the beginning. The first packet flowed over ARPANET, okay? And this is the log. The guy who did it was a programmer working for Len Kleinrock at UCLA named Charlie Klein. And Charlie sent the first packet between UCLA and SRI. And the first packet, remember that the ARPANET wasn't even envisioned for email. It was envisioned for remote login, called Telnet, and file transfer, called FTP.
Charlie Klein.
Charlie Klein, you remember him?
Yeah.
You must have been at UCLA, Dan. Yeah, I know. Okay. All right. So this is CSK is Charlie Klein, right? Okay. So this is Charlie Klein's log, and it doesn't actually say it here. Does anybody remember what the first packet to flow over the ARPANET was? What the contents of it were? It was the first 2 characters of the word login, LO, and then the thing crashed. Okay, honest to God. Okay, so some things never change. And now the question is, with 40 years of hindsight, which of these things had the greatest impact, right? And the answer obviously is, unless you're into sort of Tang and Velcro, which are the main products of the space program, or sex and drugs, the answer is the stuff that our predecessors did. It's the ARPANET, which now has, literally billions and billions of users, right? And the reason is we're hooked to this exponential growth curve. And so just to recant that, we spent 100 years on mechanical computers, right? There's the difference engine 2 on the side. I don't know if you've seen this. A facsimile of this, a recreation exists in the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and it's unbelievable. It's 11 feet long, it's 7 feet high, it weighs 5 tons. It has 8,000 parts, and when you turn the crank, it actually oozes oil, the sort of lubrication. There's a drip pan underneath that allows the oil to be recirculated. What happened was the Babbage's difference engine was actually never completed. It was essentially a British defense project in the 1800s that went over budget, and back then they canceled defense projects that went over budget as opposed to just pouring more money into them. In the 1990s, the British Museum decided to try and build a difference engine using the machine tools of the mid-1800s with Babbage's design to see if it could be done, all right? And that project, too, ran over budget and was about to be terminated. And they went to Bill Gates and said, will you fund the completion? And Bill said, no, I don't do stuff like that. But my friend Nathan Myhrvold spends money on all kinds of silly stuff. Nathan has a house that's full of ornamentations that Craig did with him, actually. So Nathan has funded all sorts of interesting stuff. Nathan said, OK, I'll fund the completion of that machine if you build a second one for me. So that's the one that's in the Computer History Museum. This is Vannevar Bush with his differential analyzer. I keep thinking the guy is not looking very happy here because he came so close to inventing foosball but didn't quite get there, okay? And then, we spent 10 years in vacuum tube electronics, and then we had the transistor and the integrated circuit and Moore's law and all this stuff, And the impact of Moore's law, just to be clear, it is literally the case that the computational power of building-sized computers in the 50s is embodied in electronic greeting cards today, okay? There are as many MIPS. And it is also literally true, I got this from a DARPA brochure, that the computational power that got those Apollo people to the moon is literally in a Furby, okay? So this is not the highest and best use of that technology, but it's still pretty remarkable, sort of how much progress we've made. And the other important thing is that, the internet has been on the same curve, right? So if you go back just 20 years, the number of internet hosts and the number of transistors on a die have each gone up by a factor of 2,000 in just 20 years. I looked this up a couple of weeks ago because it was the 20th anniversary of Microsoft Research, and we were trying to sort of look at the sort of physical progress that's been made. And so, a connected region, Seattle, used to have a port and an airport and a railroad terminus, and now what it has is communication lines that go all over the world. And that's how all the goods move, right? There are people who can see the future. I talked to a set of students about this before. Paul Barron, who's an internet pioneer, passed away last year. And in the process of that, I uncovered this paper of his from 1971. In 1971, ARPANET had, I believe, 22 computers on it, okay? And Barron wrote this report called Toward a Study of Future Urban High-Capacity Telecommunication Systems in December 1971. So remember, ARPANET then was 56 kilobits with 22 computers on it, and all you could do is remote log in and slowly move a file back and forth. And here's what he talked about: cashless society transactions, dedicated newspaper, computer-aided instructions, shopping transactions, plays and movies from a video library, banking services, library access, mass mail, and direct advertising. What could be better? Okay, so this is the guy who got it all, unlike most of us who can barely see 20 feet ahead. And the final thing I want to say about this is that software, of course, has made every bit as great progress. There's Deep Blue in 1997. This was an IBM supercomputer. 5 years later, for $20, you could buy a program that ran on a PC called Deep Fritz that had a higher chess rating than Deep Blue did. Okay. Similarly, you all followed Watson last year. This is Watson and Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. And of course, Watson won, although it was looking nip and tuck for the first night or so. The little told story about this is that a couple of weeks after that, they set up a Deep Blue contest on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and they had two congressmen play against it, Bill Cassidy and Rush Holt. Okay? And Rush Holt is a PhD physicist, about the last person who can even spell science in the US Congress. And he also turns out in his older days to have been a 5-time Jeopardy champion, okay? And Rush Holt actually beat Watson, all right? Unbelievable. One step forward for humankind, but this has been buried in the news reports, okay? And I have to say that Bill Cassidy is a conservative Republican climate change denier who got completely crushed in this process. Okay, so now that's all the past. What about the past 30 years? And again, I'll be off this historical stuff in a minute, I promise, but it's pretty interesting. A couple of years ago, this is from the New York Times 2 or 3 years ago, somebody asked a set of business school faculty members at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania to identify the 20 biggest breakthroughs in the past 30 years. Okay, so that was the test. Life changers, top innovations of the last 30 years. And why the last 30 years? Because if you go back and have to compete with the wheel and fire and stuff like that, you're probably not going to win. But so this wasn't computer scientists, it was B school professors, but this is their list of the top 20. And you'll see that half of them are just hardcore us. They may not be the ones that you would pick, but you know, media file compression, maybe so, okay? But you know, half of them are totally us. Another bunch of them are at least half us, like GPS and robotic surgery, and there's a set of them like MRI and DNA testing that are a significant fraction us. So you ask a set of B school professors for what's that worth, what are the big hits in the past 30 years, and well, they come up with a list that's almost all computer science, okay? So now the most recent 10 years, a year ago, just at sort of the turn of the decade, like everybody else, I was asked to produce a list of cool things that had happened in the past 10 years, right? And this was my list at the time of 7 things that are totally different in 2010 than they were in 2000, okay? So search, scalability, digital media, mobility, e-commerce, the cloud, and social networking, okay? And I claim that it would have been very hard to predict in 2000 what we would be experiencing in 2010. So this is a sort of what have you done for me lately version of this. And let me just look at a few of these in a bit more detail. Here's scalability. Part of what I traditionally do is computer systems work. And back just a dozen years ago, a now dead company called Compaq, which acquired a previously dead company called Digital Equipment Corporation, made the biggest sort of web server that existed. It was the DEC Alpha server. And Jeff Bezos' smiling face, back when he had hair, was in all of these DEC Alpha server ads with quotes like this: the Alpha server series knows no rival, or to support our rapid growth, we had to find a highly upgradable and scalable internet server, okay? So Amazon's growth was limited by the largest reliable multiprocessor system that DEC and Compaq could manufacture. Okay? And that's a completely laughable way, just 10 years later, to design a scalable web service. Okay? It's impossible to make hardware reliable at the scale we need it. So what we'd buy is the cheapest junk we can buy, okay? And certainly the lowest sort of instructions, or highest instructions per watt, as opposed to raw instructions. Failures occur all the time. When you're dealing with 100,000 or 1 million disks, they're going to be croaking really often. And it's all wallpapered over by software. And that software uses a set of algorithms, some of which are 25 and 30 years old. Okay? For example, the Lamport and Liskov stuff for leader election, Paxos and things like that. All right? And all of this technology, which was pretty esoteric and used by nobody at the time that the theory community developed it, is used to make these massive data centers reliable with hardware that fails all the time. And no matter how much money you spent trying to make it reliable, it would still fail. So you have to make it reliable through software. You have to wallpaper over the failures. You have to make programming models like MapReduce that make it possible to do this. And you just have to count on it failing. And the amount of money you choose to putting into the hardware reliability is merely an optimization question, a financial optimization question. Right? So that's one example. here's one more aspect of this is that operational efficiency is really central to this. So back the computer that Frank and I did our work for Andy Van Dam on many, many years ago, it was a building-sized computer that came with a person, right? You would lease the machine and it came with a guy. Okay, and the guy had a white shirt and black pants and a tie, and he was in charge of keeping that thing running, okay? And so he shipped with it. Web services of just 5 or 6 years ago typically had a support staff member for 250 servers. Microsoft today has 12 support staff for 35,000 servers around the world, okay? And the reason they have 12 is they have 6 here and 6 12 hours away in a different time zone, okay? So 6 can be sleeping while the other 6 are working. So you have to think of, this is just astonishing, the sort of scalability there. So let me talk about another one or two of these. Digital media is pretty obvious these days. Text, audio, images, video, creation, editing, consuming. The compact disc only became prevalent in the late 1980s. I got a CD player in 1985, and I still remember that the New York Times used to run stories telling you what the compact discs were from the last 6 months that were worth buying. Okay, and that lasted for a couple of years, right? And now, bless poor Kodak, right? When was the last time you saw a film camera or anything like that, right? So this is just completely transforming. I was showing somebody at lunch today this little app on my iPhone called 360 Panorama. Do any of you have that? All right, so 360 Panorama it's probably not a free app. I probably paid $2 for it. And you just sort of push a button on your phone, and then you rotate the phone around, and it takes a bunch of pictures, and it synthesizes them together and produces a 360-degree panorama and uploads it to the web. All right, so it's not just, we're beyond the point of simulating what we could do in the analog world, okay? We're now doing completely new things, and we're doing them in real time. Mobility, obviously, everybody's predictions of the future have been bogus. All of these are equally bad, but Olson of the late deck saying no one will want a computer in their home, and of course there are a billion of them today, and that's a tiny percentage of the number of computers, right? Most computers are embedded systems, which means they're not a pain in the ass, right? You don't think of your cell phone as being a problem, and actually I think of my set-top box as being a problem now because it runs a real operating system, but in general, most of the computing that we do is out in the world, and I'll come back to this point later. So now let me talk about this Computing Community Consortium, and then I'll look to the future. This was an organization started a few years ago by the National Science Foundation, and we work under the umbrella of the Computing Research Association, which you folks are members of, and it's sort of the North American version of the Canadian Association of Computing Chairs. And here's what the goal of this operation is. It is to try and get the computer science community to take a slightly longer range view of their research, to try and bully the funding agencies into making that possible, and to try and hitch computing research more to national priorities. So as much as we all like operating systems and compilers and databases and networking, most people don't care about them or don't know that they care about them. And the thing that they have to understand is that if you want a better healthcare future or a better energy future or a better education future or a better transportation future, you need fundamental advances in computer science. And the argument that we're making is that if one hitches oneself to those priorities, there'll be a lot more traction for the work and a lot more uptake in the work once it's done. So that doesn't diminish the importance of the inward-looking stuff. It just means that the reason we do that inward-looking stuff is we're trying to solve people's problems. And we ought to be more explicit about relating what we're doing to those problems. So there's a council of a set of people that sort of about 20 of us that rotates a third every year. And there's a bunch of work that we do. For example, something you can participate in is we have a pool of funds that allow groups of people to say, hey, we'd like to coalesce a research community around a particular new direction, and would you fund a couple of workshops that let us produce some white papers or things like that. We've done a lot of interaction with the US Office of Science Technology Policy on sort of directions for computing, one of which I'll talk about in a sec. There is a set of stuff for undergrads and for grad students. We've done a Library of Congress symposium. We're about to take charge of a 20th anniversary program celebrating 20 years of the US Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program. So an example is a couple of years ago, a bunch of robotics researchers came to us and they said, despite the apparent great successes of the DARPA Grand Challenge and the DARPA Urban Challenge, we actually don't have a roadmap for the science we need to do in the future. That is, as a field, we're kind of adrift. And we would like to get together and come up with a science program for the field. So we funded these guys to have a set of workshops. The result of that was the Office of Science and Technology Policy told a bunch of federal agencies in the US that they needed to do a better job of supporting robotics research. And there was a national robotics initiative to the tune of $100 million or so rolled out a few months ago. So that's the idea. This particularly, of course, is directed at the US government, but the roadmap that these folks produced and sort of all of the material is equally applicable in some other country, okay? So it's certainly repurposable materials, and it actually resulted in money getting moved. We're working now on a comparable initiative in large-scale data analysis. Another example is a third of the people who worked on this report that assessed the overall US IT R&D program were members of this organization. I was a co-chair. We sort of picked each other. And again, the goal here was to create sort of a roadmap for the future. And the simple version of it repeated something that you'll all get, which is that for 20 or 30 or 40 years, computer science has been viewed through the lens of high-performance computing, right? And it's not that high-performance computing has become any less important. It's that all kinds of other parts of the field are now of equal importance, and they still don't get any attention. Right? So even if what you're interested in is national security or scientific discovery, you need to do large-scale data analysis just as much as you need to simulate. And for all sorts of other areas, you have to look at our competitiveness in areas like robotics and things like that. Right? And the bad news is we don't have any way to quantify how we're doing in that, how we're doing in data discovery, how we're doing in robotics. High-performance computing, you know, you can reduce it to a Linpack performance number, and you can compare it to the Chinese or the Japanese, and everybody goes into a tizzy. But it's a terrible measure even of scientific computing capability, much less of our sort of international competitiveness. OK, so again, we're looking at data analytics now, at health information technology, at learning technologies, and at sustainability. And I'll say more about a few of those things. OK, so again, we're happy to have, eager to have your participation in this. This is something that the whole computing research community in North America needs to be involved in. So now let me try and look forward a bit, okay? And I'll do this from a couple of different lenses. First of all, in 2000 or so, the National Academy of Engineering produced a book that actually looked back at the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. So they had a group of people pick 20 great engineering accomplishments of the 20th century, and 3 of them were arguably us, the internet, computers, and electronics, which we take partial credit for, okay? A few years later, they came up with grand challenges for the next century. Okay? And a much greater percentage of them have at least a partial contribution of computer science in them. So again, this is what a sort of balanced group of engineers say is going to matter in the next century. So health informatics, a lot of that is us. Secure cyberspace is clearly us. Tools of scientific discovery is largely us. VR, I wouldn't have picked this, but that's us. But then reverse engineering the brain, engineering better medicines. Nuclear terror prevention is to some extent a sensor network problem. Personalized learning has a big component of what we do. So we're looking much more central to what's going on. Butler-Lamson has this view of this that says we've spent 40 years doing simulation, 40 years doing communication, and now we're going to spend 40 years doing enablement. Okay, so simulation is this scientific stuff. Communication is all the stuff we use as information technology, as communication devising, and embodiment is sort of robots in unstructured environments, which I'll say more about in a bit. And in that same spirit, here was my list from that article a year ago. So this is what I said, my 7 for the next 10 years, all right, which was put the smarts in everything. So now I'm just going to say a word about most of these, okay? So so let me talk about a few of these, and some in more detail than other. Keshav and his students are doing very, very similar work here, and I was just thrilled to see it. I hadn't followed it in detail. Shwetak Patel is a young faculty member of ours who joined us a few years ago from Georgia Tech and just won one of these MacArthur Genius Awards. He is, in fact, a really clever guy, I have to admit. And here's what Shwetak has done. He and his students have designed single point of attachment sensors that fully disaggregate your energy usage. All right, so that means you plug this in the wall in one place, and it tells you exactly how much power each device in your home is using. So normally you would have to instrument each device independently. Okay? And how does it do it? Like everything else in computer science, it's machine learning, right? So it turns out that every time you throw a switch, it puts a spike on the power line. When you turn on your Panasonic 50-inch TV or a complex fluorescent light, it modulates the power line for the entire time it's turned on. All right? And if you have two Panasonic 50-inch TVs, they're going to wind up being different run lengths away from where you chose to plug in the sensor. And those run lengths of wire will change the signal somewhat so you can tell them apart. So this thing starts from a web database and then a bit of training and eventually does 90 or 95% correct disaggregation, right? And like the work Keshav has been doing, it's a cheap device. It's not your home power meter. So it doesn't cost many hundreds of dollars, and if it breaks, it doesn't cause the power company to get upset. It's a consumer electronics device that hopefully by this fall you'll be able to purchase at Best Buy and plug in the wall. Okay? And so the idea, Schwedek is actually an HCI person. Okay? He happens also to be a licensed plumber and electrician. He's one of these guys who worked on his own car in high school, right? I don't get this at all, okay? But his real interest is how do you present information to people in order to change their behavior? And all of us love playing games, right? I was saying to someone earlier today that, whether you drive a sort of gas-guzzling BMW or an efficient Prius, that gas meter, efficiency meter, turns you into a more efficient driver. You're trying to beat your spouse, right? Be a little more efficient than your spouse is. You just wish your spouse would play the game as well, in my case, all right? But that's the idea, okay? And so there is really cool computer science wrapped up in what Schwedek is doing. This is not an application. All right? It's great work ranging from the sensor design to the networking to the data analysis to the presentation of the data to change behavior. Okay? It's just unbelievably cool stuff. And again, it's very, very much in the spirit of what Keshav and his students are doing here. And it's a risk to do that stuff because many of us don't embrace it. But part of the message here is embrace this kind of stuff. By the way, Schwedek and his students have also built sensors that disaggregate your water usage and your gas usage, okay? And the water sensor is really cool. It turns out that your whole home water system is interconnected through the hot water heater, right? There's cold in and hot out. And every time you open a valve or flush a toilet, it sends a pressure transient through the water system, okay? So his water sensor is, think of it as a rubber diaphragm, and you thread it onto a hose bib somewhere that you're not using, and then you open the faucet. So the home water system is now pressing against this rubber diaphragm. And every time you flush a toilet somewhere, it goes wubble, 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 and generates a little current. And again, you can machine learn the signature of various sinks and toilets and dishwashers and washing machines and stuff like that, okay? Same deal. And the gas one is an acoustic sensor that hooks onto the regulator of your gas meter. If you walk by a restaurant at night, you'll hear the gas meter sort of singing to you, and it sings different tunes depending on who's consuming the gas and things like that, right? Very, very clever stuff. So smart homes are in our near-term and long-term future, okay? And of course, the smart grid and on up. And something that the Department of Energy doesn't get is smart homes as the leaf nodes of the smart grid, okay? They understand simulation for new energy resources, but they're paying very, very little attention to this sort of smart instrumentation at the home level. And to the extent they are, both in Ontario and in the United States, what they've done is to spend literally billions of dollars rolling out last generation dumb smart meters that in the case of the states tell you your aggregate power usage once every 15 minutes. And in the US, it telemeters that up to the energy company, and it's actually a violation of the terms of use for you as the consumer to access that data, because the energy company wants to sell it back to you at some point, I guess. All right? So this is just sort of putting it in the consumer's hands in a way they can use the information. Smart cars, you know about the DARPA Grand Challenge and the DARPA Urban Challenge. There's just been astonishing progress in this. And you see some of this in cars today. You've got lane departure warning and adaptive cruise control and self-parking if you've got a fancier car than I do. But you've also got Google autonomous cars driving around 101 in California, okay? So it's important to, yeah. Vic's holding his head, right? This is why we're up here in safe, sane Ontario, okay? And presumably there's somebody in this car who's prepared to hit the big red button if things start going south. My impression, someone mentioned today that they've only actually had one accident. I don't know if it was a biggie or a littlie, but it's not like most of the people driving on Highway 101 are paying attention to what they're doing. They're texting, right? For God's sake, okay? So this is just unbelievable progress. I was mentioning to somebody, the grad students in the last session, that Andy Van Dam and Raj Reddy and John Hennessy and Gordon Bell and I have a series of technology bets going back 20 years. And Raj Reddy is always the optimist. He always loses these bets. The payoff for the bet is that the losers have to buy the winners a dinner of their choice with the only stipulation that the wine can't cost more than half of the cost the wine has to be less than half the total bill. So these can be very expensive meals. And Raj has taken us out to dinner time and time again because he's an eternal optimist. And in the case of cars, actually, Raj and I made a 10-year bet in 1995 that there'd be autonomous cars by 2005, and we had to pay off. But we were only off by 5 or 6 years. Right? And this is Raj's view. It's that, it's all going to be true within 50 or 100 years, so don't quibble over 5 or 10, It's just not a big deal. And it's absolutely true. I think optimists like Raj always overestimate what you can do in 10 years, but dramatically underestimate what you can do in 20 or 30 or 40. And, this autonomous driving stuff is very cool. And, there is some safety aspect to this, right? So automobile accidents in the US are it's a heck of a big market, okay? There's this ad that I saw on the web for Mercedes, which says it's no substitute for active driving involvement. Okay, it turns out that all of the safety features in cars, airbags, anti-lock brakes, and stuff like that, what they do is allow us to drive faster and closer together and do more texting. It's not clear that it has reduced the accident rate, but there are other aspects to it, okay? Which is, you can imagine there are issues related to energy or productivity or social equity or the cost of manufacturing cars that are as high impact as the safety gains it will make. And Sebastian Thrun at Stanford, he and his students won the Grand Challenge and finished second in the Urban Challenge, has a great riff in which he makes all of transportation sound like a computer science problem, okay? So, can you get real-time sensor information for transit routing? Personalized real-time information for choosing travel options. If you want to reduce, let's assume that we believe people are always going to be drivers of single occupancy vehicles, but could they be shared vehicles, right? It's easy to compute that the average utilization of a car in North America is about 5%, because it's about 12,000 miles a year and there's so many hours in the year, okay? Suppose you made it 10% or 15% or 20% by putting Zipcar or whatever your local version of that is on steroids. That's entirely a computer science and a logistics problem. It's where do you position the cars? How do you route them? How do you allocate them? What's the funding elasticity and things like that, okay? And so suddenly what you're doing is reducing the number of cars in the world, which reduces the incredible environmental and financial cost of manufacturing the things. You'd obviously like to route around not where the congestion is now, but where the congestion is going to be in 20 minutes, all right? Seattle has 2 bridges across Lake Washington, which are incredible bottlenecks. And what you want to know when an accident happens on one of those bridges is not just where the congestion is now, but I'm going to have to make a decision that's going to get me to the other side of the lake in 20 or 30 minutes. And what route should I pick? What is the traffic flow likely to be? Where is the congestion likely to flow? And there's actually 20 years of sensor data collected that's not being utilized, right? And that sensor data is much cheaper to collect today because it's in everybody's iPhone. It's not just sort of sensors in the roads. You can imagine getting better vehicle sensor density, not by building new roads or special lanes, but by allocating a lane to cars that have stay-in-lane systems and adaptive cruise control, which would increase their density. Again, if you use sort of Google-style cameras, you can find that the average density of a typical highway in the US is, again, only about 5%, except when it's stop and go because of the gaps between cars. You can imagine reducing those, which lets you carry as much capacity with less roads. Okay, I'm going to talk about health for a minute. I'll speed this up a little. It's pretty clear. The question I always ask is, why is my car so much better instrumented than my body? Okay, so I go into the auto dealership, not with my car, which is 20 years old, but with my wife's car, which is newer. And the person at the dealership, who I guess is still called a mechanic, but really isn't, jacks a little computer in under the dash and reads out on a computer all the performance data for the past 6 months and figures out what the trouble is. And when I go to see my personal physician, she sort of hits me on the knee and says, "Where does it hurt?" Right? This is crazy, and this is going to change very rapidly, and it's probably, in fact, going to change through the sort of health nut market, right? All sorts of bicyclists and marathon runners and stuff like that have a large amount of instrumentation now, and they have the disposable income to afford this stuff, but eventually it's going to penetrate far more widely. Obviously, evidence-based medicine is just sort of data mining and machine learning. Lee Hood at the University of Washington in Seattle does work on what he calls P4 medicine. So this is the genotype-phenotype correlation. There is smart robots moving forward. We've spent decades with robots in structured environments, robots bolted to the floor in sort of factory settings. Now, I mean, this is a crude example, but Rodney Brooks' iRobot, these robots in unstructured environments are everywhere now. And it's going to really proliferate. So these are robots that interact with you in your world rather than being bolted to the floor in an environment that they can predict. And you see these in factory settings, you know, Amazon's pickers and things like this. Here's a combination of smart health and smart robots. Our other MacArthur winner at the University of Washington, Yoki Matsuoka, just got $40 million from the National Science Foundation for an engineering research center in what's called sensory motor neural engineering. And think of this as prosthetics directly coupled to the nervous system, right? So on one hand, literally, she has the world's best prosthetic hand. All right, and the truth is most people who have lost their hands use hooks or graspers or something like that. And there are two reasons. One is that people have not designed robot hands with deformable palms and the sort of things that you really need for dexterity. But the other is if you have a spinal cord injury, you don't have the signals to control that sort of robotics. So you have to work both ends of it. You have to build the prosthetics and you have to figure out how to do the spinal cord coupling. Yoki used to be at Carnegie Mellon, and they're working with people at Pitt. She had this little monkey named Quincy. I'm assured that Quincy was a happy monkey, but Quincy had a prosthetic left arm, and he could actually reach out with his prosthetic left arm and take a piece of orange from you and feed himself, right? And this was entirely controlled by an 8x8 grid of pins embedded in his skull, okay, doing digital signal processing, right? And this stuff is by no means ready for prime time, but it's sort of a vision of what's going to be possible at some point. So that's what Yoki's trying to do. Again, you know, this is by one view a medical application, but by another view it's unbelievably great computer science and bioengineering. I'll spend a little more time on this because it's what I've been working on the past 5 years. I run this thing called the UW eScience Institute, and the goal of this is to bring data-intensive science to people across the campus, right? And what you see across the entire campus is great scientists managing their data in a way that's 6 years behind the time, which means a couple decimal orders of magnitude behind the time. So Jim Gray is really the guy who launched this effort big time in the US about 10 years ago. And the way I think about this is that science has gone through there've been a set of legs of the stool. For years there was sort of theory, and there was experiment, and there was observation. This is from my oceanography friends, okay? And what's interesting is that oceanography today is still done largely in this way, which is you go to sea in a ship and you stick your instruments in the water where you happen to be, and you measure temperature, salinity, and pressure. And this is how we learn about the environment that covers 70% of the Earth and is responsible for all of what we do, okay? So, you know, 30, 40 years ago, this started being augmented by simulation-oriented computational science. And then through Jim's work on the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, we moved to this era of eScience. So the Sloan Digital Sky Survey totally transformed astronomy by taking what was for its time a massive amount of survey data and making it available on the web to school kids and professional astronomers simultaneously. And what was really interesting was the history of astronomy had been that a grad student would spend 3 years designing an instrument for a telescope and then would finally get some telescope time to deploy the instrument, and he was going to be damned if he was going to make the data available to anybody else because he spent 3 years building the instrument, and this was his thesis, okay? And with the survey astronomy, people realized that there was vastly more data available than any small group could use. And it's estimated, I'll get this slightly wrong, but the estimate is roughly that 50 times more research results have been done through the widespread availability of this data than would have happened if the group that started the Sloan project had kept the data themselves. So the telescope used for Sloan was this Apache Point telescope, and over a 7-year period, it generated 80 terabytes of raw image data. So I'm going to use that number to compare to what's going on now. So that's 80 terabytes in 7 years. The new survey astronomy project, this Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, is going to generate 40 terabytes a day. So that is a 7-year Sloan Digital Sky Survey every 2 days. And this is valuable data. That is, it actually provides you much greater resolution to do astronomy. Large Hadron Collider, 60 terabytes a day, so 2 7-year Sloan Digital Sky Surveys in a day. These sort of sequencers now generate a terabyte a day. Labs at UW have 25 of these things running simultaneously. The project I've been working on is the regional scale nodes of the Ocean Observatory Initiative. So the idea here is to turn oceanography from an observational science into an observatory science by deploying 1,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable and stringing it with chemical and physical and biological sensors and making all that data available. Okay, so it's a really interesting project that's sort of the big science project in North America now. The original version of this was in fact deployed by UBC and UVic off the coast of British Columbia. So there's a thing called Neptune Canada, which is, I have to say that Canada is much more agile than the United States. This fellow John Delaney at the University of Washington had this concept a number of years ago and has spent the past 10 or 15 years getting the US government to fund this, which has been like kicking a dead whale along the beach, okay? And meanwhile, NSERC just got this going in British Columbia. So they're actually delivering data in Canada while we're still laying cable in the US. The web is obviously a gigantic sensor network. So the point of this is all the world is drowning in data, point of sale terminals, and the automated analysis of this data, or semi-automated analysis, is what's really necessary, and almost no scientist knows how to do this. And at every level of the science pyramid, people are ages behind, and this is all computer science. It's sensor networks, databases, data mining, machine learning, visualization, and there's great research for us buried in all of this. It's married to the cloud. This hairy guy is an undergrad of ours who 4.5 years ago now, 5 years ago, on his 20% time from Google, came back to UW and helped me do the first sort of Google scale computing course in North America. And you know now that Google and Microsoft and Amazon have these services that you use. And the important thing, and one thing we're trying to do in the eScience Institute, is what I say, get computing out of the closet and into the cloud. We have people running on racks of servers in closets, and it makes no sense. Here's an example. This is a company called Animoto. Has anybody ever used their service? This is something that's so dumb, even my kids don't do it. Perfect, he uses it, okay? And here's what Animoto does. You give them an MP3 file and a bunch of JPEG images, and they produce a syncopated slideshow. And it takes a couple of minutes of computing, okay? Maybe 6 minutes of computing to produce a 30-second syncopated slideshow. And this is a graph of the number of Amazon Web Services images. Think of that as virtual Amazon PCs that they were using. This is now 3 years ago. It's back in April 2008. And you see they were bopping along about 30 or 40 machines. And on April 16th, they introduced a Facebook version of their app. And within 2 days, they were using 3,500 computers, right? And Amazon just absorbed this. And of course, what happens is at the end of the month, you get a bill on your credit card. And if you've managed to find a way to monetize something this dumb, then you actually have a way to pay the bill. And the important thing to me is lots of science looks like this too, right? Which is you're piddling along on small-sized data sets, doing algorithm experimentation until a couple weeks before a conference deadline, okay? And then suddenly Kawanga, all right? And then it drops off again, all right? And we have a set of perverse economic failures in universities that make it hard to realize how cost-effective this is. Santa Claus pays for the power, Santa Claus pays for the cooling. Your grad student does the backup, except they usually don't. All right, somebody else built the building, all right? But by any reasonable measure, this is the way we ought to be doing most of our science. And a huge amount of science, not just computer science, but other science, is embarrassingly parallel. This is a slide from Werner Vogels, who's the CTO at Amazon.com. And it's a picture of the tasting room in a brewery somewhere in Europe, okay? And all it's used now for is drinking beer. But that big thing in the middle is what used to generate the electric power for the brewery. Okay? And Werner's pitch is that 10 years from now, if you're running your own data center, it's going to be just as smart as generating your own electricity. And this doesn't mean that I'm against solar arrays on the roof or anything like that. It just means that there are a set of people who, on a large scale, are more capable of cost-effectively generating power than we are. And there are also a set of people who are more capable of generating utility computing than we are. And people have to get with it, and it's very slow. So this eScience, everybody's going to be doing it. 10 years ago, if you were a sociologist and you wanted to study the sort of creation and evolution and dissolution of cliques, you'd hire a bunch of undergrads for $6 an hour to participate in a focus group, right? And now the sociologists at UC San Diego have access to 500 million users worth of Facebook data. They're going to blow the whole sociology community away with this, right? That's sort of how it works. And again, it's this eScience. So that's what we're trying to do in this eScience Institute. Let me just skip through this, but I have to say that all the scientists on our campus get this, and the people who don't get it are the university administrators. And the reason is that when the vice provost of research wants to know what kind of computing people need in the future, she goes to someone who calls himself a computational scientist. And that's an astrophysicist who's been simulating for the past 20 years. And what he says is, I need more simulation cycles. But if you talk to great scientists across the campus, independent of how they label themselves, they all tell you they're drowning in data. So that's the message of this work. Here's an example that I just ran across a couple of weeks ago, despite it coming from some biologists at the University of Washington. It's big data analysis of bibliographic citations. So the point here is just this affects every field. And Eigenfactor is worth looking at. It's a really interesting interactive website. There's much more that they can do. But this example in the lower right, I really like. What it shows is the birth of the field of neuroscience. Okay? And this is done by tracking millions and millions and millions of journal citations. Right? And what you see is that back in 2001, as recently as a decade ago, neuroscience was distributed among a bunch of fields, neurology, molecular and cell biology, and stuff like that. And there's been this confluence into a field that's characterized as neuroscience, as exhibited by a set of journals now. Right? So there's incredibly interesting patterns you can explore by looking at this data. OK, I mentioned smart crowds and human computer systems. Have people heard Luis von Ahn talk? Okay, so Luis gives an absolutely brilliant talk. Here's where he began. So he sort of pioneered this field of human computation. He discovered that the number of hours per year spent playing computer solitaire is 9 billion. Honest to God, okay? And the number of human hours spent building the Panama Canal was 20 million. So less than a day of solitaire labor, okay, would build us another Panama Canal, right? So his question is, what if you could harness this for something useful? So Luis begins his talk by showing people a CAPTCHA. And he says, how many people did one of these in the past couple of days? And everybody's hand goes up. And then he says, how many people were really annoyed? And everybody's hand stays up. And then he says, I invented that. Right? And he did. And of course, the idea here is to keep bots from getting email accounts. But for the past couple of years, you've had to do not only one of these, you've had to do two in this thing called a reCAPTCHA. All right? So you have two squirrely things. It's twice as annoying. Okay? Does anybody know what the reCAPTCHA is, what the idea is here? Go ahead, tell me.
So they are trying to OCR some books, and they don't necessarily know what this is. So they know one more than that.
Great, perfect. So one of these is computer generated, and the other one for the first year came from the 100-year photographic archive of the New York Times. Okay? And so the New York Times back to 1980 is available in digital form, but from 1980 back to 1880, it exists only in photographic form. And you want to OCR it, convert it to digital so that you can search it. And because these are 100-year-old smudged newspapers that dogs have bitten on and stuff like that, the OCR doesn't always work. So what they did was to take the 20% of this 100-year New York Times archive that had fooled the OCR, and they turned it into the right-hand half of these reCAPTCHAs. Okay? And in just a year, they digitized the entire 100-year New York Times archive, okay, by you proving that you're not a butt getting an email account. Okay? So unbelievably cool. And then he did this Google image labeler. And now I'm going to talk about an application at the University of Washington, which is really cool. This guy, David Baker, is a biochemist who owns a code called Rosetta, which is sort of the world champion program for protein folding and protein structure calculation. So you do this, for example, because you want to design a new catalyst for a reaction that Mother Nature didn't care about. It may have to do with environmental cleanup or something like that. So you have to design a protein that behaves in a particular way. Or you want to design a vaccine that locks into the binding site of some parasite. So David, for years, was the user of most of the rack space at the University of Washington. And then at some point, he discovered that this is actually embarrassingly parallel, and he turned it using BOINC into a screensaver application. It's embarrassingly parallel because you're trying to find an energy minimization fold of the protein. All right? And the way you avoid getting stuck in a local minimum is you start at millions and millions of different places and optimize down. And you hope that one of them finds the true energy minimum as opposed to a local minimum. So now he's got this thing running on a couple 100,000 screensavers using BOINC, and he starts getting email from people. These are random people using this as a screensaver saying, your program is dumb as dirt. It's doing this when it should be doing that. So he went to Zoran Popovic in our department and said, is there some way to turn parts of this into a video game? All right? So that users can actually contribute to it, and they built this game called Fold It, all right? And so Fold It now has a couple 100,000 people playing it, and these are people who are doing the protein folding. By all means, use this, and Zoran has a thing called the Center for Game Science now at UW, which is doing both games for science and games for learning. He has astonishingly $12 million from the Defense Department for building games to teach elementary school kids how to do fractions. Okay? And in return for this, he had to spend 1 month building a game to help 19-year-olds avoid improvised explosive devices. All right? Go figure. Anyway, so hundreds of thousands of people playing this game. Teenage gamers were beating the pants off PhD biochemists, all right? Because teenagers have some sense of sort of 3D that those of us who didn't grow up on video games lack. The current champion most recently was this guy named Boots McGraw, not a teenager. He's sort of a hick who lives in rural Texas. And Boots, they all have their own version of a Facebook page. Boots was the first guy to design a protein that was actually fabricated in the lab. So the lab that fabricated the protein sent Boots a plastic model of the thing. And Boots has this comment on his webpage. He says, I'm really happy to get this thing. I'm going to bring it to the office so when my coworkers once again ask me why I don't want to play Farmville with them, I can show them the model. Okay? So this is from just 2 weeks ago, all right? 100,000 gamers solved a protein structure problem important to AIDS research that had eluded the scientific community for 10 years. All right, gamers using Folded. And Zoran is quick to point out that it's not just the person power, not just the manpower you're throwing at this, it's that each of us has different capabilities. And if you can integrate enough different people's different capabilities, you get sort of the superhuman. All right, you get a set of capabilities that no small collection of people could possibly have. So it's actually not just the labor that's being utilized here, it's the diverse talents that are being utilized. It's just a really cool notion, and there is unbelievable potential in this sort of stuff. All right, I'm getting close to the end. This is still the human computation stuff. This guy, Tony Tether, was the director of DARPA in the Bush administration. Tony was really bad. Horrible. At some point, we got rid of the guy, okay? And he was replaced by this woman named Regina Dugan, who's still the DARPA director for the past 3 years ago. She came in shortly after Obama, and she hired for a year Peter Lee to run this new office in DARPA. So Peter had been the head of computer science at Carnegie Mellon, and after a year at DARPA, he now runs Microsoft Research in Redmond. And Peter has one flaw. Okay, so let me say that he was commuting from Pittsburgh to DARPA, to Arlington, Virginia, okay, for the first 6 months or so of the job. And he had one flaw, which is he drives a hot car. He has a GTO with a Corvette engine and blacked out windows. And he was within one ticket of using his driver's license for speeding, going between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. And that was going to be the end of his gig at DARPA. And then somebody introduced him to Trapster. Anybody ever use Trapster? Trapster is crowdsourced speed trap detection, okay? So you think about the history of speed traps. They invent radar, so you get a radar detector. So they switch to laser, so you get a laser detector. So they make detectors illegal, so you get an expensive little one that fits under the hood, okay? What happens with this thing is you're driving along, you have your iPhone up on the dash, the GPS knows where it is. When you see a speed trap, you come to where someone has reported a speed trap, it goes beep, 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 beep. You slow down, okay? And once you get past the speed trap, it gives you a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and you tell it whether the speed trap is still there or not, all right? And of course, if you see a speed trap in time, you hit the button and it uploads that to the database. Okay, so now, having been at DARPA just briefly, all right, Peter was given the opportunity to go speak to Secretary of Defense Bob Gates. And what are you going to say to the Secretary of Defense? So he doesn't quite know what to do, so he shows Gates Trapster. Okay, and it turns out Gates is a speeder too. Okay, so Gates really grooved on this, and then Peter showed him this Google Maps mashup, which is called North Korea Uncovered. Okay, and this was started by a grad student at the College of William and Mary, and it is all sorts of intelligence data about points of interest in North Korea that comes from people with iPhones. All right? So the question Peter asked Gates is this from, $1 billion spy satellite or a bunch of intelligence operatives or people with iPhones? All right? And there's a long history of extracting information about points of interest. Certainly whenever anyone left Eastern Europe after World War II, they were debriefed, but it took 9 months or 9 years for that data to get into usable form. This is instantaneous. So that led to this thing called the DARPA Balloon Challenge. Okay, the DARPA Balloon Challenge was one day, a year or so ago, DARPA put 10 10-foot diameter red weather balloons on sort of 40-foot strings above 10 places in the US, and some of them were can't miss it, like Union Square in downtown San Francisco, and some of them were a little more obscure, like Katy Park in Katy, Texas. I didn't know there was a Katy, Texas, okay? And there were 4,000 teams registered to try and find this through social networking. And the important thing here is that the US intelligence agencies told Peter Lee that they would not be able to find these balloons, and furthermore, that nobody else would be able to find them, okay? And there were 900 submissions, 370 teams found all 10 correct locations, and the MIT team that finished first finished in something like 7 hours, okay, by crowdsourcing these results, okay? So So the point of now, obviously, there's a whole bunch of stuff you do. You have to get the noise out of the system. There's going to be a whole bunch of cruft. People played crazy games here. Obviously, there were a huge number of sort of fake Photoshop balloon sightings because every team had 10 slots to enter sightings. And if you fill up your slots with fake Photoshop balloon entries in the wrong place, there you go. But more interestingly, a bunch of people in Russia actually hacked the domain name service. So for a period of time, all other teams' entries, instead of going to the server at DARPA, were going to these guys in Russia, okay? So there's really great subterfuge, okay? And there was a several $1,000 prize, a cheap prize, several tens of thousands of dollars. But what the MIT team did, and they had only decided to enter a couple of days before the contest, was they had a very clever scheme for dividing the spoils among the people who had constructively contributed to the correct sightings, okay? So the whole design of incentives here is really interesting, okay? And there's a whole bunch of the theory community that's now looking at economic incentives for stuff like that. So that's sort of this human-powered computing, okay? Almost done. Smart interaction. You know the Connect. The thing you probably don't know about the Connect is it does things that nobody could do before, and it comes from 4 different Microsoft research labs, right? And one of the real breakthroughs here is that within Microsoft Research, the speech people had only on a very limited basis ever talked to the vision people, right? But it turns out that the localization you get from the 4 microphone array can contribute to the vision system's decision about who it should focus on and vice versa, okay? So building a system versus just doing speech or just doing vision gives you enormous advantages. So now I'm done. Here's my 3 exhortations. The first is to decide that these sort of things that look like applications are actually part of our field. And the thing that made the biggest impression on me is a paper by Bob Luckey, who used to run Bell Communications Research. And this wasn't quite its title, but the phrase, this is now about 15, 18 years ago, was the last electrical engineer. And here's what this picture is. It's an inverted pyramid. And the inverted pyramid is what everybody does with your technology, okay? It's the apps. And what he says here is that if we don't embrace those applications, then eventually there's only going to be one of us. And that person is going to be the last microprocessor designer, and he or she is going to be very well compensated, but you can't really support a whole field on just one person. Right? So, and I didn't take this as a ding on electrical engineering. I took it as a cautionary tale for computer science. Right? So either we decide that these interesting uses of what we do drive our research agenda, or else eventually there's only one of us. It's a compiler writer sitting around somewhere. Okay? Second is use both sides of your brain. Right? So we're all left-brained people. Okay? And there are Jobs, who unfortunately passed away last week, is clearly a person who used both sides of his brain. Right? So he was not fundamentally a technologist, but he helped design great technology. But he had this incredible taste for design. And more, we're going to be solving problems that involve sort of humans and human systems using our technology. And if we take just a technology view of it, we're going to be toast. This is the greatest quote about Jobs I saw. This is from The Onion last week. Pardon me, but it's kind of true. And they had a mock interview with Barack Obama. He said, well, I used to know what I was doing, but even I don't know what I'm doing. Okay. So I think it's sad that this is largely true. This is a slide I got from Julio Latino at Northwestern, and he's a sort of history of science buff. And it turns out that at the same time, within months of each other, both Thomas Harriot in England and Galileo in Italy utilized telescopes to observe the moon, all right? And it was only Galileo who figured out that the moon had craters, right? And this is ascribed to his participation in the philosophical and artistic aspects of what was going on in Italy at the time and understanding perspective drawing and things like that, okay? So Harriot was, like most of us, a meat and potatoes person. All right? And he looked at the same thing Galileo did, but the notion that those were craters, that there was three-dimensionality, the view had been that the moon was a smooth sphere, which might have had some spray painting on it, okay? But this notion, Galileo figured it out and Harriot didn't. So that's the sort of both sides of the brain thing. And here's the final one, it's be a myth buster. And since we're over time now, I won't spend any time on this, but there are a whole bunch of myths about our field. And I'd like to be able to phrase these in a positive way as anti-myths. But the fact is, this is a field with a great research agenda. There's tons of stuff going on. And there's actually hard to imagine a field with greater promise or greater ability to positively affect society. it's hard to imagine any societal challenge, whether it's education or energy or transportation or you name it, that can be solved without computer science keeping moving forward. Okay, so the third exhortation is to dispel this set of myths. Now, clearly you've got 100,000 undergrads in your program here, so you're not actually having a student attraction problem, but nonetheless, at least in the US, I think many of these things are still sort of prevalent. They die hard. So get rid of those guys. That's the story. I really appreciate your attention. Sorry to be a bit over time. And this guy is on the web at that address if you want to find the slides. Thanks for your attention. I know people have to go. I'd be happy to take a couple questions if there are any.
Do you have any questions?
If not, we can all go where it's cooler. Yeah, please, Vic.
So, sort of devil's advocate
Yeah.
to your presentation. First, you talked about how we got really far in 30 years.
Yeah.
By doing whatever we wanted, fundamental research, blah, blah, blah. Then you said, well, it's really important that we change how we decide what to work on.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile?
Yeah, so this is an obvious concern, which, as I said, we did great for 30 years by doing compilers, and now we should completely change what we're doing if we want to keep doing great. And it is a little hard to reconcile this, but I think that we spent 30 years making the core of the field better, and I think honestly that more and more people, we're victims of our success in the sense that all of humanity uses our technology today, right? And I think, at some level, we've always taken our motivation from problems people want to solve. Meaning, if you weren't in the business of solving people's problems, you'd be in a math department, right? You're in a computer science program because you actually want to solve people's problems. And at some level, all I'm saying is be conscious of the needs of the problems that people want to solve when you think about your research agenda, which I think the best computer scientists always have done. Right? I mean, the folks at if I think of my systems community, right? The folks at Xerox who were doing Altos and Ethernets and bitmap displays, they had a set of human empowerment problems they were trying to solve. And, I think you look at the great work done at, by the folks at a company like Pixar, right? What they're trying to do is help the animators tell a story, and, maybe posed as I need realistic fur. But the idea here is help people tell a story. So I think lots of the best work has always been motivated in that way, but we're sometimes a little resentful that people don't want to just fund us for doing operating systems. And we should just get used to that. Let me give you one other example, okay, which is back when I was a grad student and before then, all of Carnegie Mellon, which is by any measure one of the world's great computer science departments, was floated on the ARPA speech project. All right, so ARPA wanted to do speech understanding. That was their big shtick in the 1970s, all right? And that funded all of CMU's multiprocessor work, all of their operating systems work, all of their language work, all of their AI work on Blackboard systems and things like that, okay? All of this was motivated by this problem of attempting to do speech recognition. Now, granted, it took us another 40 years to do that properly, but I think taking this motivation from problems people want to solve is, in fact, always what we've been doing, and we shouldn't resent it. We should embrace it.
Further questions?
Yeah.
I don't know if my question was actually really central to what you went over, but it seems like one of the biggest problems would be to convince the right kind of people to be able to fund research. And since we're trying to get people to fund research in our department, like in our areas, there's definitely people trying to get people to fund them for their areas. So isn't there competition between two fields trying to get money from people? Like, we should be able to kind of coordinate between, say, computer science and neurobiology and get the scientists from those fields to work together to get money and stuff.
So here's how it works in the United States, at least, okay? National Science Foundation is the only non-mission agency, all right? Everybody else has a mission. And obviously, part of what we're trying to do is to help those people understand that their mission requires fundamental research in what we do, all right? So we want the energy department to understand that they need home sensor networks, right? And we want the Department of Health and Human, and as I say, they understand simulation. The National Institutes of Health and Human Services understands they need electronic medical records. They don't understand genotype-phenotype correlation, and they don't understand instrumented bodies, and sort of so on down the line. So that's definitely part of the goal of this. I think the important thing to realize, though, is that if you're going to do work that's relevant, you have to actually understand what the requirements of that work are, right? So I think the people who've done high impact work in computational biology are people who've taken the time to learn the biology. And there's, when I look at what your energy people are doing here, Keshav, and what's happened with our folks, they've gotten a pretty deep understanding of what the energy systems problems are in trying to work in that. So I don't think there's a sort of cheap way to do it, but it's clearly the goal and I think the one other thing I would say in the US is that the amount of money invested in computing research is trivially small compared to other areas, all right? So for example, the NIH budget, National Institutes of Health, which is 100% an outsourced research budget, okay, is north of $30 billion a year, okay? And the National Science Foundation computing research budget is about $500 million a year. Okay, so it's 1/60th or something like that, all right? And so I was back testifying to Congress about this stuff 2 weeks ago, and part of the message is we're sort of a rounding error, and we're responsible for the success of all these other fields, and we're responsible for, it's a hard year to talk about economic prosperity, since there isn't any in the US these days, but to the extent that there is any, we're responsible for that as well, and it's done on a complete sneeze. Here's the one other aspect related to research funding, and then I'll stop. I realize we got to go. In the US, there's a big emphasis on industry R&D, as there is here. And in the US, industry R&D is measured by what companies take the R&D tax credit on. And they take the R&D tax credit on any engineering activity. Okay, so Microsoft is actually one of the few information technology companies in the US that invests in anything looking more than one product cycle out, right? And that's the people at Microsoft Research, and there are 850 of them, and Microsoft spends hundreds of millions of dollars on that every year, but it's only about 4% of their R&D budget, okay? And Cisco spends 0% of their R&D budget on this, right? Cisco's R&D is M&A, they acquire companies. EMC bought VMware and RSA Security and Data Domain and Plumtree and most recently Isilon from Seattle. They've done nothing but acquire over the past 10 years since they acquired Data General in 2000 or something like that, okay? So those things they're going to acquire have to come from somewhere. And a mistake that happens is policymakers look at the corporate R&D budget and decide that that's somehow research, right? And Microsoft's 4% is gargantuan compared to any other company as a percentage, except for IBM. Nobody else is anywhere near in that business. So there's a government role here, and it's not like companies are behaving badly. They're doing what their shareholders demand. It's life. Thanks a lot, everyone. I really appreciate it.